Hey everybody, welcome to this video, and we're going to be illustrating a real-world Tableau REST API use case. So this tutorial is really going to show us how you can make use of the REST API endpoints to pause or unpause Tableau extract refresh tasks. So there are there's a fork in the road here, and there are two different paths you could take. One path would be that all of your tasks that are running on a certain schedule should all be paused and unpaused together. This would be really you planning ahead and having probably a lot of different schedules that exist in your Tableau server environment. By the way, this would only work for people who manage their own Tableau server environment or use a service like visstack.io, which lets you run on Tableau server, but they manage the platform for you. But the reason it only works on Tableau server is that you need to be able to create schedules and manage schedules yourself. So on Tableau Online, Tableau manages those schedules for you, but in Tableau server, you can create schedules. So in my case, I have some schedules here, and I have Devix Test Weekly that I created, and I also created the schedule down here. In a Tableau Online environment, you're just going to have, you're going to have many schedules available to you. The limitation is that you can't create new ones. But in any case, looping all the way back around, this first approach that we're going to look at is the simple scenario where you are updating a schedule and you are activating or deactivating the schedule, which essentially gives you the ability to pause and unpause that schedule for all the tasks that are associated with it. Then the second approach we're going to look at is something that's probably the boat that most of you are in, which would be that you have a workbook. So let's say this one that I created here for this example, tutorial extract refresh tasks. And maybe you have multiple workbooks that you want to pause the extract refreshes for. Now, if that is running on a schedule, there's a good chance that there are lots of other workbooks or data sources that run on that same schedule, and you don't want to pause the tasks running for those data sources and those workbooks, but you want to pause them for specific workbooks. The tricky thing is that if you go out to the REST API documentation, while there is an endpoint for us to update a schedule, so to activate or suspend a schedule and all of its tasks, there is no endpoint for us to update a specific refresh task. So what we are going to do is we're going to build a little bit of a process that's really kind of using our own creativity to make what we want to have happen. And we're going to do that using some Python code, and we're going to do that using this Tableau REST API documentation to figure out which of these tasks we need. So let's go ahead and dive in. So we are in a Jupyter notebook, and we're going to go ahead and explain pretty much line by line this entire process. So from top to bottom here, I'm just going to import some packages that are really useful to us while we're building up this workflow. Pandas is a must-have if we're working with data in Python. It's going to allow us to put our data into nice rows and columns formats and then really have a lot of control over the data that we're working with. And then I'm going to import some things from Tableau API lib. By the way, Tableau API lib is the library that we're using in this tutorial. This library lets us tap into the Tableau REST API and make use of a lot of those endpoints that you see documented here in the Tableau REST API reference without us having to build all of this from scratch. Like, okay, I need to do a put request. I need to provide certain information to that request. That request needs to have a request body that looks like this. Do we really want to build this from scratch, or do we just want to use a library that's going to allow us to pass in a few simple parameters and then all the other stuff gets built for us behind the curtain? We don't have to worry about it. So we are making use of the library here. And then we're also going to make use of some functions that are going to make our lives a little bit easier. Querying functions come in handy for us to query information about our workbooks, about our schedules, about our extract refresh tasks. and then the ability to flatten certain pieces of information that come in as a response from the server. We'll see how this will be really useful to us in a few minutes. All right, so for starters, we need to define our configuration details. If this is completely new to you, I recommend you go check out the Getting Started with Tableau API Lib videos. We explain this in depth. And yes, you could try to use these credentials to log into my environment, but hopefully I'm smart enough to delete that personal access token before this video is published. So once we have the configuration defined, we can establish a connection. So I'm going to go ahead and establish this connection by defining an instance of Tableau server connection and passing into it my configuration from up here, and then the environment within the configuration that I'm referencing. So with that, we are now able to sign in to the server, and that really means that we have fetched an authentication token, and from now on we can issue other API calls to the Tableau server, and it's going to know that we are an authenticated user and it's okay to send us information back. So these scenarios we've already explained. Approach 1 is going to be our more simplistic scenario where everything already exists on a schedule and we just want to pause the schedule or then reactivate the schedule. And then approach 2 is going to be that more involved process where we actually have to say, okay, there's no REST API endpoint that does this pausing and unpausing for a specific task right out of the box, but we can get creative and we can basically find the extract refresh tasks, the specific tasks we want to pause, and we could just delete those. And then we could make sure that we know what workbook that task was associated with and what schedule that task was associated with. And we can log that somewhere so that if we wanted to unpause those tasks, we could just recreate what used to be there. So we're deleting things and then creating things from scratch again, but the effect is that it seems like it's been paused and unpaused. So for that approach 1, where we just want to update a schedule, let's see what this looks like. So for starters, we are going to just use these querying functions that are built into the Tableau API lib to easily fetch data throughout this tutorial. For now, we're just using this for the schedules information. So when we run this, we're basically querying the underlying methods that the library is using. They're just using stuff that's documented out here in the Tableau REST API. And it's handling all kinds of stuff like pagination and all that for us so that we don't really have to worry about it. And at the end of the day, this just spits out a pandas data frame to us. Hence why we have this suffix at the end of all these variable names that's df, just stands for data frame, because we are working with pandas data frames. So schedules df comes out from this function, and we can see down here what this is going to look like. This is just a lot of information about the schedules that we have in our server environment. And one piece of information we get about all of our schedules is whether it is a schedule that runs extract refreshes, or is it a schedule that runs flows, or is it a schedule for subscriptions? And in this case, we really only care about the schedules that are running our extracts. So I'm going to go ahead and filter using this pandas data frame filtering syntax. Filter this to only give me data frame or rows relevant in the data frame to extracts. And then we can see that we indeed only have information for extracts. So now that we have information about our extract schedules, we can just hop on down here and we can say, all right, which schedule is the one that I want to pause and then later unpause? Now we could just copy and paste the IDs. These would be our schedule IDs right here. But in the spirit of you taking this code and integrating it into your own workflows, I just wanted to give an example of how you could programmatically extract the ID value for one of these rows. In this case, the one that I'm interested in is the row that's associated with a schedule named devix test weekly. That's this guy down here. And I'm just going to use this code we see in this line to grab that row, convert that row's contents into a list, and then fetch the single value that I get for that column that's ID. In this case, this is my schedule ID. So I run that, I end up with my target schedule ID, and we'll use this to update that schedule and change it to have the state of suspended instead of active. So this is really, really simple. If we look at the REST API documentation, we can see that there is an endpoint for update schedule. Out here, the official documentation names it update schedule. So fittingly in the library, we call on a method, since we have our Tableau server connection stored in this variable called con, standing for connection. We just do con dot, and then one of the methods available to us is update schedule. Now for update schedule, we need to pass in some information. A lot of these things are optional. Like we could update the schedule's name, we could update the frequency that it's running on, the time intervals, etc. But in this case, we only care about pausing and unpausing the schedule. So that's the only thing we're going to modify is the schedule state. So the two states that this schedule could have are suspended and active. So in this case, we are going to change this to be suspended. And we can take a look at the output, and we can see that this response we got from the server is saying, all right, the schedule is now suspended. And indeed, if we come out and we look at our schedules, so let's go down to schedules, devix test weekly, we can see that this is now disabled. So every task that's associated with the schedule would now be paused. So you've essentially paused everything that's related to the schedule. And if you wanted to unpause that, you could come down to the next couple lines where we again update the schedule. We're updating the same schedule in this case, and this time we're setting it to have an active schedule state. So we can run this, we can verify that the response from our server is not indicating that there was any kind of error. It looks like this was successful, and we can go back and we can test this by refreshing in our Tableau server environment and seeing that, all right, this is no longer disabled, and we have a next runtime. Okay, so that is the simple scenario, but once again, this is probably not very realistic for a lot of teams where your schedules are more about a specific time that you want to run something. And many of your ETL processes might need to run that don't have anything to do with one another. They might need to run around the same time. And so you end up putting a lot of different things onto the same schedule. Now, if you have control up front, it might be worth considering, do you want to create a bunch of different schedules, even if they have overlapping times, and if they're very similar to one another? Maybe you do want to go through the trouble of upfront planning out your schedule layout so that you have certain ETL dependencies that run on the same Tableau server schedule, so it's easy for you to pause and unpause those tasks. Like, for example, you have a certain piece of your data pipeline fails, and you figure, let's go ahead and pause all of the extract refreshes running on Tableau that are related to this particular pipeline so that we don't waste resources running these background tasks on Tableau server, because it does consume CPU performance. It's going to degrade your server's performance while you're running these background tasks. And what's the point in running that if all of the data that is being processed is irrelevant anyways, because there was an ETL failure and you're going to need to run it again later anyways. So in any case, you could plan everything ahead, have your schedule set up such that you are suspending and activating your schedules to handle this need to pause and unpause certain extract refresh tasks. That's totally valid. And then we have this other scenario where things are a little bit more complex. So things are more complex in approach 2 because, once again, we don't have a REST API endpoint that's going to allow us to simply update the status of a specific task we can update the schedule and therefore every single task that depends on that schedule. But if we want to update a specific task, we just can't do so, at least not at this point in time. So what we're going to do instead is we can take a look at some of these, and we can see that while we can't modify an existing extract refresh task, what we could do is we can add a workbook to a schedule, which creates new tasks. And we can also delete extract refresh tasks. Another thing we can do is we can get extract refresh tasks in a site. So if we think about it, a roundabout way of updating a specific extract refresh task, if we need to pause and then unpause that task, something we could do is we could query all of the existing tasks. Some of the information that's going to be provided to us when we query those tasks is the workbook or the data source that task is associated with. So then we can cross-reference that information with what we know about the data source or the workbook whose tasks we want to pause. And then we can basically say, all right, I found all of the tasks related to this workbook. Let me loop through each of these tasks and delete them, which is me essentially pausing those tasks. And then at a later point in time, I can come back and I can add that workbook or that data source back to the schedule, which then in the background, the server is going to create tasks for me for the related data source or workbook extract refresh tasks that need to be in place. So what this all looks like is, first, we could start out by using, once again, the querying section of the Tableau API lib library to get all of the extract refresh tasks that exist on our site into a data frame. Now, this gives us a really good starting point, but there is some information that's kind of in an inconvenient format right now. Like, for example, if I'm going to be deleting a bunch of tasks with the intention of recreating them in the future, something I'm going to need to know is, in this case, I'm working with a workbook's extract refresh tasks. So I'm going to need to know the workbook ID, and I'm also going to need to know the schedule ID. So at a future point in time, I'm going to want to create I'm going to want to add this workbook to this schedule. And you might be thinking, all this information's right here, it's in front of me, so I'm good to go. But not really, because it's in a nested object. So something we can do is we can unpack the information that's stored in those columns using this flatten dict column function. So these these objects, they're in kind of JSON format, or in the Python world, a dictionary. And so that's why this is called flatten dict column, because it's going to take that dictionary and it's going to allow us to flatten it, which means we're going to take some, for example, this ID, the schedule ID, and we're going to turn it into its own column in our pandas data frame that's called schedule ID. So let's do that. Let's use that extract refresh task data frame, and let's unpack certain pieces of information. And for starters, in this case, since I'm only concerned with my workbook that I want to pause tasks for, I'm going to go ahead and filter my extract refresh task data frame to only consider entries that are relevant to workbooks. Up here, you can see that that not all of these rows are relevant to workbooks. Anywhere I have this not a number, this NaN, that's probably a data source. So we can see here, anytime that the extract refresh task is associated with a data source, that data source column is populated with some information. Whereas if it's associated with a workbook, then you have a workbook column that's populated with information. So just to make our lives a little bit easier in the next few steps, we could go ahead and just filter to only consider workbooks. So we do that, and we end up with a much smaller data frame. Granted, this is on my test server, so we only have 2 workbooks that are running extract refresh tasks. And at this point, we can go in and we can flatten those columns. So we want to extract the schedule ID. We also want to extract the workbook ID. So for the schedule, there are two pieces of information that might be useful to us, the ID and the name. So we go ahead and we run that flatten dict column where we say my data frame that has a nested dict column that I want to flatten is this guy right here, workbook extract refresh task df. And then the column name, that's the column that I want to flatten. In this case, it's schedule. And then the keys that exist within that. Now keep in mind here, the keys that you pass in, if you pass in a key that doesn't exist, you might get an error. So do keep that in mind and look ahead of time, plan out which keys you want to extract. So in this case, ID and name are two values that do exist within this object. And you could find out what exists here if you went out to the documentation and you see, all right, this get extract refresh tasks in a site endpoint. Let's see what this has going on. And we can see what a typical response looks like. So for schedules, we see that we get the ID, we get the name, we get a lot of other information. And then for this case, we've queried our extract refreshes, we've flattened the schedule column. Now let's also flatten the workbook column. Let's take a peek out here, and we can see in this example, this extract refresh task is associated with a data source, and you get just this one single piece of information, which is the ID. If this task is relevant to a workbook, instead of getting data source here, you're going to get workbook, and you're just going to get the workbook ID. So when we flatten that workbook column here, we don't want to extract ID and name because only ID exists. So we're just going to extract ID. And we do that, and now we can see this data frame's looking a bit different. Now, instead of just having a column like we originally had up here where we have schedule and then some nested information inside of it and workbook with some nested information inside of it, now our final data frame here, we have a nice column here called schedule ID, and it has the schedule ID just ready to go. Same thing for workbook ID, and we even have the schedule name. All right, so that gets us one step closer to where we want to be. Now we have a nicely formatted data frame that has all of the workbook extract refresh tasks inside of it. And at this point, we want to go ahead and filter this out to only consider the extract refresh tasks that are relevant to the workbook we care about. So in this case, I only have 2 workbooks on my server, but you can imagine in a production environment, you might have thousands of workbooks that have extract refresh tasks associated with them. And so what we're doing in this step is we're saying, here are 2 different tasks that exist. I actually don't care about both of these. I care about one of them, and the only piece of information I have about it that indicates which workbook this is relevant to is the workbook ID. So what I need to do is I now need to query my workbooks, and I need to, maybe I know my workbook name. So there are lots of different ways you could identify the workbook you care about, but the most common way that you're going to know is by going out to your Tableau server, looking at the actual content in your server and saying, oh, this workbook that has refresh tasks that I want to pause, it's named tutorial extract refresh tasks. So I don't necessarily know what the workbook ID is, because as you can see out here in the user interface, there's not that kind of information supplied to me. I can click all around and I can look for this all I want, but it's not something that's really exposed to you in the user interface. So what we can do instead is we could go ahead and use the querying method of or the querying section of the Tableau API lib library to get our workbooks data frame. And that's going to get all the workbooks that are existing in this Tableau server connection that I've established. And something important to note here, that you as a user have permissions to see. So in this case, I'm a Tableau server administrator, so nothing can hide from me. But if you are a viewer or an explorer, just be aware that if you're logging in, if you're establishing this connection using your credentials, then you're only going to be able to see the things that you have permissions to see. But I can see all of these workbooks, and now I have not only the workbook ID, but I also have access to the workbook name. So what I could do is I could come down here and I could say, all right, what's my target workbook name? Or provide a list of target names if you have multiple workbooks that you want to pause, extract, refresh tasks for. In this case, I only have one that I care about, but I figured I'd demo this in a way that if you had multiple names, you could just add in more names. And in this case, I only care about one, so I'm going to delete that and go ahead and run this. And what we're doing is we're filtering our workbooks data frame to only consider workbooks whose name is in. So if the name matches any value that you created in this list, then we're going to have that information in this target workbooks data frame. In this case, it's just one row because there's only one workbook I care about. And now we can access all kinds of information about this workbook, including its name, its ID, and maybe even something that's useful is to have some context about what project this workbook belongs in. Now for a project, we can see this is nested information, but I'm not really going to worry about flattening that because it's not immediately relevant to what we're doing in this tutorial. But you could flatten it if you wanted to. So now what we can do, since we have the data frame that has all of the extract refresh tasks relevant to workbooks on our site, and then we have another data frame that has just the workbook that we care about. Both of those data frames have this information about a workbook ID. So what I'm going to do if I only want to know, or if I want a data frame that has the extract refresh tasks for this specific workbook, what I could do is I could join those two data frames based on this ID. And in order to do that, just to make my life a little bit easier, I'm going to recognize that in my extract refresh task data frame, I had my workbook ID stored in a column named workbook ID. And I think that name is really intuitive and convenient in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and rename from my workbooks data frame. I'm going to rename that ID field, which is indicating the workbook ID. I'm going to rename that to be workbook ID so that then I can just join on this field that both data frames have in common, and we'll end up getting the desired result. I'm also here specifying a subset of columns, trimming the fat, so to speak, because I don't really care about all this this other information that came out to me about all of my my workbooks. I really only care about what's the name of the workbook, what's the workbook ID, and then maybe if I need to use this for some other purpose, I might also want to preserve what the project information was. All right, so I run this, and we can see down here I get my 3 columns of output for my target workbooks data frame. Here's my workbook ID, here's that workbook's name, tutorial, extract, refresh tasks, and now I'm going to do this join. And in the pandas data frame world, a really convenient way to do joins is using this merge method that exists for pandas data frames. And I pass in here first of all, my data frame that I'm going to have on the left side of the join. So this is my target workbooks data frame. That is just this information right here. And then I'm going to merge in with that all of my data that's sitting inside of my workbook extract refresh task data frame, but only where the workbook IDs match. So only extract refresh tasks that match this workbook ID are going to end up coming out on the other side. And if I run this, then we can see that now I have those 3 fields that I started with right up here, name, workbook ID, and project. But then I've also joined in all the information that was sitting there inside of my extract refresh task data frame. So that gives us the schedule information. So that's the schedule that this task is running on. It gives me the schedule name, and now I also know, the workbook ID, but also what was the name of that workbook. And the reason that I've joined all of this together is that now we're going to enter this process of, okay, I have all the information that I need And now in order for me to pause these extract refresh tasks, there's just one way of doing it. This is the way I would go about doing it personally. I'm going to loop through those tasks. And in this case, it's just one task, but we'll see how we could do it if this were a use case where you have more tasks that you're wanting to pause and unpause all at once. You can use the same methodology, but we are going to loop through this data frame that we have here. And for each data frame, we're going to remove the task by its ID. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take the same information and at a later date, let's say we wanted to unpause these tasks. So keep in mind, we deleted that task, so there is no unpausing it. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to say, well, that task existed in a schedule, and that schedule just had all the tasks sourced from a specific workbook. So what we're able to do is we're able to then just create all those tasks that we deleted once again, as long as we know what the schedule ID was and what the workbook ID was. So in order to preserve that information, I'm just going to write this data to a CSV file. And what we get here is something that looks like this. And it's literally that pandas data frame that we had just written to a CSV file. Now, if you're building this into a production pipeline, you probably you'd want to maybe write this to a database. So there's also different ways you can do that using pandas, but I'm not going to cover that here. In this case, a CSV is just fine for me. Maybe even in a lot of production pipelines that might do the trick for you as well. But this just allows us to preserve this information. So it tells us the information about the tasks that we have paused. So now in some future timeline, we can input that data, we can reread what we had paused, and then we can use that to construct these new tasks. So let's just see how this plays out. We want to pause all these tasks, which is really just deleting the extract refresh tasks. And so we create an empty list here. What this list is going to do is for each of the tasks that we're deleting, it's going to take the response we got from the server and it's just going to dump that response into the list. This is really nice to have because then after we run all of this, where we run through and we loop through each row in our data frame. So data frames have this method called iterRows, and allows you to iterate through each row in the data frame. And then what we do is we say, I'm going to have my pause task response from the server, which is equal to whatever the server sends me when I issue this request. So I use my Tableau connection to execute this delete extract refresh task method. And that all it needs is a task ID, which in this case is the ID of the extract refresh task that we want to remove. And then we take that response from the server, we append it, and we end up with something that looks like this. And if we were to go out to Tableau's documentation, we could see that there is an endpoint for deleting an extract refresh task. And the extract refresh task deleting an extract refresh task would return us a response code of 204 if it were successful. And we can see out here that we did get a 204. And we only got one of these inside the list because once again, we are just in this tutorial deleting one single task. All right, so now let's say the problems in the ETL pipeline have been fixed. We want to have those tasks running again on the same schedule they used to run on before. Well, we outputted that data frame that had the information about all the tasks we wanted to remove. We had outputted that to a CSV file. So now we can read the data from that CSV file and we can read that into a pandas data frame. So we can do the exact same process we saw before, except this time, instead of tearing down those extract refresh tasks, instead we are looping through that information and we're making sure that for each row in this data frame, we are going to add a workbook to a schedule. Now, this would also work for data sources if you used add data source to schedule. And once again, what is this method? How can I learn more about it? You go out to the REST API documentation and you find the endpoint that matches the Tableau API lib method name. So in this case, add workbook to schedule. If you wanted to know more about this, here it is. So out here, we are adding a workbook to a schedule. And for each row in that data frame, we get our workbook ID from the column that's called workbook ID. So that tells us which workbook we're adding to the schedule. And then we also need this schedule that we're adding the workbook to. And we have that because we wrote that into the CSV previously. Schedule ID. So if we run this, now we can see we get a response of 200. And if we look down here in the Tableau documentation, that is good news. That means it was successful. So what we can do now is we can go back out here to our Tableau user interface, and let's run through some of those steps again really quickly and just verify that this actually does disappear when we pause it. So right now we're looking at our tasks that belong to the schedule devix test weekly. And if I go into my Jupyter notebook and I come all the way back up here to where we started defining our extract refresh tasks data frame, let's just run all of this to the point where we delete the tasks. So we have paused these tasks. We get the 204 response, which is a successful deletion of the task. We come back out here to the Tableau user interface. We refresh this and we look at this list of things that the devix test weekly schedule is running. And we can see for extract refresh tasks, that one that was here previously for our target workbook is gone. So there's still a task that's running on this schedule, but we have removed the task that we were targeting, that we wanted to pause. And now that information about what we paused is sitting out here in this CSV. We can see updated seconds ago. So when we ran this again, it overwrote what was in the CSV. And if we want to unpause that schedule, unpause that task, again, we deleted the task, so there's nothing to unpause. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to read in the data from that CSV file, build ourselves a nice little pandas data frame, and then we're going to loop through that data frame and we're going to say, let's add all the workbooks in here to the schedule, where our workbook ID is sourced from the workbook ID column and the schedule ID is sourced from the schedule ID column. So we do that. We see that we get successful response for all of those entries that were in the data frame. Again, in this case, it's just one. And we can go out here to our user interface, refresh this, and we have that extract refresh task inside the schedule once again. So that is it for this tutorial. That takes us through both use cases of whether you organize all of your tasks to run on the same schedule and you simply activate or suspend that schedule. Honestly, that is probably the more bulletproof solution. But the real life scenario that most Tableau teams are going to be in is that you have not planned your schedules to exist in that format, and instead you just have a random bag of many different things running on a schedule. And if that is the situation you're in, this is where you can take this approach that we just walked through, and you're basically looking at the REST API reference as if it's just a menu of options. Okay, we can create things, we can delete things, we can query things. And we're just using this basket of functionality to stitch together this use case, this scenario of I would like to have the effect of pausing something and then re-enabling it, but I don't actually have an endpoint that allows me to pause and re-enable it. So what I can do instead is I can find out what are these tasks that I'm interested in pausing. I can just delete those tasks, and then I can make a note of what I deleted so that at a later point in time I can come in and I can recreate those same things. That's exactly what we did here today, and I hope that this is useful and valuable to you. And tune in down the road, we'll be doing more of these code along videos.